Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, Wilder historian Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time Hooker and the Army of the Potomac battled on the peninsula, but now he and his division are boarding ships for Northern Virginia. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Hooker and his division traveled from the peninsula to Aquia Creek, a landing location for many of the troops coming from George McClellan's army on their way to John Pope's Army of Virginia. However, the troops wouldn't disembark there. They went on to Alexandria, disembarked, and went by rail to Manassas Junction, barely missing Confederate General Stonewall Jackson as he captured the railway in the rear of the Union Army. When Pope discovered that Jackson was behind him, he dispatched some troops to deal with him. Those troops would be Joseph Hooker's division. The Confederates that Hooker discovered around Bristow Station were simply attempting to delay Hooker while they destroyed track and captured supplies, but Hooker was able to land a few blows against the withdrawing Confederates. The rebels withdrew to the Old Manassas battlefield, and Hooker bivouacked at Blackburn's Ford. Jackson took refuge behind and in an unfinished railroad cut. One of Hooker's brigades was detached from the division and fought with Franz Sigel's troops for a time during this second battle of Manassas. Hooker launched attacks against Jackson's fortified position as ordered by his superiors, and although some of his men found success, the attacks, as Hooker explained, produced senseless bloodletting to gain no military advantage. One of Hooker's biographers explained Hooker's frustration with the battle. The day's action had been unsatisfactory for Hooker. His division had been split and sent in by brigades, some not even under his direction. They had suffered heavily and nothing been gained. Only Grover's charge was as distinguished a performance as the Hooker division could have been expected to give. When Confederate General James Longstreet arrived with the other half of the Confederate Army, he delivered a massive attack against Pope's forces, sending the Union troops retreating over the Virginia landscape. After getting his division on their way to safety, Hooker continued to help other units get out of harm's way, riding back and forth, organizing the disorganized, and making sure as many men got on the road following the rest of the shattered army. At Centerville, Virginia, Hooker and his division rested, but Hooker personally was ordered to come to Pope's headquarters. Pope wanted him to take his division and move north to stop a possible rebel threat. Hooker informed Pope that his men were exhausted and too bloodied to fight so soon. They had lost roughly a third of their fighting force. So Pope dispatched Hooker alone, telling him to take command of any troops he found along the way and block the Confederates from cutting the Union Army off from Washington. In a downpour on September 1st, 1862, the Battle of Chantilly broke out, with much of the fighting happening to the left of Hooker's line. Although the Union soldiers blunted the Confederate advance, it came at a terrible price. Philip Kearny, Hooker's friend, was killed in the engagement. When the body came back into the Union lines, under a flag of truce, Hooker commanded the troops it passed through. The sight of the body greatly affected Hooker. The day before Kearny died, Kearny wrote a letter discussing the Second Battle of Bull Run. In it, he wrote, "The army ran like sheep, all but General Hooker." The Army of Virginia streamed back to Washington, D.C. following the defeat. Abraham Lincoln now had a decision to make. Who could take command of the Union Army in the East? In a meeting with his cabinet, the president and the other officials labored over who to name as the head of the army. Pope had failed. McClellan was slow and worked against the administration, and Irvin McDowell had lost his first battle, the first major battle of the war, the first Battle of Bull Run. One of Hooker's biographers described the scene. Lincoln asked Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles whom he would suggest to take command of the Army of the Potomac. Without much consideration, Welles named Hooker. Nodding approvingly, Lincoln responded, "I think as much as you or any other man of Hooker, but I fear he gets excited." Postmaster General Blair, who was present, then put in a damper, saying, "He is too great a friend of John Barleycorn." Welles replied, "If his habits are bad, if he ever permits himself to get intoxicated, he ought not to be trusted with such a command." Lincoln ultimately chose McClellan to lead the army. He hadn't been removed as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. The troops had just been taken away from him and given to Pope. McClellan was in command of the forces guarding the capital, but now the troops that made up the Army of Virginia were in the capital. McClellan now took command of the Army of the Potomac with the addition of the corps from the Army of Virginia. A reorganization of the Army took place as some generals left the Army. Hooker received his long-awaited appointment as a corps commander, taking command of the 3rd Corps of the Army of Virginia, which had originally been the 1st Corps of the Army of the Potomac before it was detached. As Hooker moved his new corps into Maryland, chasing after Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, his corps was renamed the 1st Corps, reverting back to its original designation. Both the 1st Corps under Hooker and the 9th Corps under Jesse Reno were under the command of Ambrose Burnside as they headed into the Maryland countryside. The close proximity of the Confederate Army to Pennsylvania scared that state's governor, and he called on the president to send him 80,000 troops. He didn't, but he would send him a general, a Pennsylvanian, to organize the state's forces. John Reynolds was named as that general, but he commanded a division in Hooker's corps, one of the better commanders under Hooker. Hooker wrote a letter to McClellan to fight back against sending Reynolds away. I request that the Major General commanding will not heed this order. A scared governor ought not to be permitted to destroy the usefulness of an entire division of the Army on the eve of important operations. General Reynolds commands a division of Pennsylvania troops of not the best character, is well known to them, and I have no officer to fill his place. It is satisfactory to my mind that the rebels have no more intention of going to Harrisburg than they have of going to heaven. It is only in the United States that atrocities like this are entertained. Reynolds was sent to Pennsylvania despite Hooker's misgivings, and a brigade commander named George Gordon Meade took command of the division. Meade, hearing the protest, felt his own character was sullied by Hooker's strong will to keep Reynolds in command of the division. Nevertheless, Hooker and the 1st Corps proceeded west, towards South Mountain, where Confederate General James Longstreet's wing of the Confederate Army guarded the mountain passes there. Hooker was ordered to take Turner's Gap in South Mountain and dispatched his troops accordingly, with Meade performing great service that got Hooker's attention, enough to give the division commander praise from Hooker. As the fighting intensified, McClellan came up to Hooker and asked who was fighting on the National Road. Hooker replied that it was John Gibbon's brigade of Western men. McClellan exclaimed, "They must be made of iron," and Hooker replied, "By the eternal, they are iron. If you had seen them at Bull Run, as I did, you would know them to be iron." This exchange between McClellan and Hooker gave the brigade its immortalized name of the Iron Brigade. Sunset essentially brought an end to the battle, and the next day Hooker's corps pushed through South Mountain. The Army of the Potomac found the Army of Northern Virginia outside the little town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. On September 17th, Hooker's corps moved forward to attack the left flank of the rebel army. Hooker rode close to the action. A newspaper correspondent wrote, "Hooker's eyes gleamed with the fierce joy of battle, and he disposed his forces with wonderful rapidity. Shot and shell fell about Hooker and his staff, covering them with dirt and making horses almost unmanageable." Hooker exposed himself to danger that morning, getting his horse wounded in the process. When Hooker saw a wavering regiment, he sent orders by way of a newspaper correspondent named George Smalley to its colonel. The colonel balked at the thought of getting an order from anyone other than a staff member. Smalley said he would report his insubordination to Hooker. The colonel allegedly said, "Oh, for God's sake, don't do that. I had rather face the rebels than Hooker." At one point, Hooker rode to the very front, a dangerous place for a corps commander to be. Seeing the danger, he dismounted to get away from the enemy bullets while he analyzed the situation, then remounted. Soon Hooker swayed in the saddle and was helped down when he was a safe distance away from the fighting. A surgeon looked him over and found that a bullet had went through his foot, but he couldn't tell if any bones were broken. The general was put on a stretcher and taken away. His last order on the field was, "There is a regiment to the right. Order it forward. Crawford and Gordon are coming up. Tell them to carry the woods and hold them, and it is our fight." The pain was incredible, and Hooker passed out at least once. He attempted to relay information to General Edwin Sumner about the situation to his front, but was too weak. Hooker was taken to the Pry Mansion, the headquarters of McClellan. That afternoon he was transported to Centerville, Maryland, where he wrote a letter to his brother-in-law. "A great battle has been fought, and we are victorious. I had the honor to open it yesterday afternoon, and it continued till 10 o'clock this morning, when I was wounded and compelled to quit the field. The battle was fought with great violence on both sides. The carnage has been awful. I only regret that I was not permitted to take part in the operations until they were concluded. for I had counted on either capturing their army or driving them into the Potomac. My wound has been painful, but it is not one that will be likely to lay me up. I was shot through the foot." This letter found its way into the newspapers a few days after the battle, and many began to take this account as completely true, that had Hooker not been wounded, the Union would have crushed Lee's army and driven it into the Potomac River. All this added to the growing support by the public and politicians of Hooker's ability and his reputation. For his efforts, his friends in California raised $5,000 to make him a sword, but before it could be presented to Hooker, it was discovered that a general couldn't accept a gift of that value from a group of individuals. So it was put on display in Sacramento until the state legislature could pass a resolution to purchase it and present it to Hooker. Some Californians bought him a huge white thoroughbred stallion to be presented to the general. Hooker convalesced in a room in the Washington Insane Asylum where he received guests, one of them a cabinet member. The Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, arrived on September 23rd with his daughter Kate. They presented the general with a fruit basket, and Chase and Hooker discussed the status of the army. Lincoln would later say of Chase that his head was full of presidential maggots, meaning he wanted to be president, and Chase felt that getting close to the general he felt would win the war would allow him to rise up politically. Chase returned to Hooker's room on multiple occasions, further hedging his bet on Hooker being the standout general of the war and hoping to get on his good side in the event Chase ran for president. As Hooker recovered, he began to take trips around the city to see various officials, including Secretary Chase and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. However, the most dangerous visit was to Senator McDougal of California. At the senator's room at the Willard Hotel, an inventor was demonstrating a weapon for Hooker and the senator when it accidentally went off, firing a bullet between the general and the senator. According to a newspaper, the three men continued to talk as if nothing had happened. All of Hooker's politicking didn't result in him being named the commander of the Army of the Potomac when McClellan was finally removed from command. Ambrose Burnside now commanded the army. He was hesitant to take command, but allegedly took it to keep someone like Hooker from leading the army. Hooker rejoined the army on November 11th, being informed that he would now command the 5th Corps, but that would be short-lived. Burnside reorganized the 6 corps into 3 grand divisions, with Hooker commanding the Center Grand Division, encompassing the 3rd and 5th Corps. Despite him now commanding 40,000 men, this did not deter him from criticizing his superiors, Burnside, McClellan, or John Pope. He wrote a letter criticizing all of them to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Burnside called his Grand Division commanders together, Hooker, Edwin Sumner, and William B. Franklin. Burnside suggested crossing a few miles downriver from Fredericksburg, but Sumner and Franklin weren't enthused about that idea, but they said they would follow Burnside's orders. Hooker suggested to cross the Rappahannock River about 12 miles upriver from Fredericksburg. Ultimately, Burnside decided to cross at Fredericksburg in the face of the enemy. Franklin's Grand Division would be on the left, Sumner's on the right, and Hooker's would follow Sumner. On the morning of December 13th, with much of the Union Army across the Rappahannock River, ready to attack Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia on Marye's Heights and Prospect Hill, Hooker, Sumner, and Burnside watched from the Lacey House. Hooker was already mad by this point because 2 divisions, his own old division and Kearny's old division, 2 of the best, were detached and given to Franklin. Hooker was ordered to take the rest of his command across the river, which was basically now just the 5th Corps, now commanded by Daniel Butterfield. Butterfield and himself were greeted by generals from Sumner's failed attacks against Marye's Heights. They told Hooker not to order his men in. Hooker went personally to Burnside and asked for a discontinuation of the attacks, but the orders were unchanged. To add to Hooker's anger, another division was taken from his command and sent elsewhere, meaning as Grand Division Commander, he only commanded 2 divisions instead of 2 whole corps. One of those divisions, under Andrew Humphreys, made a forlorn attack against Marye's Heights and was dismantled. When the last division under Hooker was ordered in, he stopped it, saying later, "Finding that I had lost as many men as my orders required me to lose, I suspended the attack." At the conclusion of the Battle of Fredericksburg, Hooker commanded the troops who occupied the town, and a few days later, when Burnside ordered all the troops back across the Rappahannock River, Hooker supervised the movement of those soldiers. Also following the battle, Hooker testified for the first time before the Committee on the Conduct of the War, criticizing two men primarily, Burnside and Franklin. He believed Franklin had not done all he could do to win the battle. In January, Burnside attempted another offensive, a march, to get around Lee's left flank by crossing the Rappahannock upriver from Fredericksburg. The march devolved into a quagmire as soldiers, animals, wagons, and artillery struggled to move through the deep Virginia mud. This incident further convinced Hooker of Burnside's inability to lead the Army of the Potomac. Burnside couldn't stand the backbiting happening in the Army and wrote his General Order No. 8, which said in part, General Joseph Hooker, having been guilty of unjust and unnecessary criticisms of the actions of his superior officers and of the authorities, and having by the general tone of his conversation endeavored to create distrust in the minds of officers who have associated with him, and having by omissions and otherwise made reports and statements which were calculated to create incorrect impressions, and for habitually speaking in disparaging terms of other officers, is hereby dismissed from the service of the United States as a man unfit to hold an important commission during a crisis like the present. Not only did he propose to remove Hooker from command, but he wanted to remove others, including William F. Smith and William B. Franklin, for similar reasons. All those Burnside listed had gone behind the general's back to criticize him to the president and other politicians. Burnside's staff asked him to not issue it until he had shown it to the president. Burnside agreed and took it to the president, along with a letter of resignation. Lincoln would need to accept one or the other. Lincoln said he wouldn't act on anything until he discussed it with his cabinet members. Lincoln would say to his advisers, "This is all true. Hooker does talk badly, but the trouble is he is stronger with the country today than any other man. Even if the country were told of Hooker's talk, they would not believe it." The discussion for the next commander of the army began between Lincoln and his cabinet. Burnside could not be kept on. The three highest ranking within the army was Hooker, Edwin Sumner, and William B. Franklin. Franklin was now seen as a contributing factor in the defeat at Fredericksburg, so he couldn't be chosen. Sumner was too old. That left Hooker out of the Grand Division commanders. However, three other men were thought of. William S. Rosecrans, the victor at the Battle of Stone's River and the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, was talked about, but because he was a Westerner, they didn't want to put him in command of an Eastern-dominated army. George Gordon Meade, who had just been put in as commander of Hooker's 5th Corps, was a top contender for the position, and John F. Reynolds of the 1st Corps was also suggested, but Reynolds didn't want the position. That left Meade or Hooker. Lincoln chose Hooker. One newspaper declared when it heard the news of Hooker's appointment, "With Rosecrans in the West and Hooker in the East, there is not treason enough in the North, rebellion enough in the South, or imbecility or cross purposes sufficient in the cabinet to prevent the war for the Union from being brought to an early and satisfactory conclusion." Hooker got word of his appointment and issued his General Orders No. 1, which stated in part, "By direction of the President of the United States, the undersigned assumes command of the Army of the Potomac. Since the formation of this army, he has been identified with its history. He has shared with you its glories and reverses, with no other desire than that these relations might remain unchanged until its destiny should be accomplished. To secure these ends, your commander will require the cheerful and zealous cooperation of every officer and soldier in this army. In equipment, intelligence, and valor the enemy is our inferior. Let us never hesitate to give him battle wherever we can find him." Afterward, Hooker left for Washington to meet with Lincoln. After their meeting, Lincoln handed Hooker a letter building up the new commander, but also rebuking him for fostering ill will and backbiting within the army, especially against Burnside. Nevertheless, Hooker returned to the Army of the Potomac with a renewed vigor and a determination to lead it to glory on future battlefields.